Hi everyone, welcome to Mobile DevOps is a Thing, a podcast by Bitrise showcasing developers from all around the world. Today we're going to talk about building mobile infrastructure, the journey from self-hosted Jenkins to the cloud, and streamlining CI processes. My name is Nora Basie, and I'm here today with two of my colleagues, Damien Murphy, technical sales engineer. Hey Damien, how are you?
Hey Nora.
Thanks so much for joining. And our developer advocate, Kevin Toms.
Hi there.
Hey, Kevin, thanks for joining. And our special guest today is Russell Stephens, mobile infrastructure lead from Compass. Hey, Russell.
Hi.
How are you?
I'm doing great. Happy to be here.
Thank you so much for coming to the show. We're super excited to have you here. So you're the mobile infrastructure lead at Compass. What else can we know about you? What's your background when it comes to mobile and CI/CD?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've spent about 10 years working in mobile, way back on iOS 4.3. I remember when building apps was a couple different separate applications. It wasn't all integrated into Xcode at that point. Retain, release, all these things pre-Arc. So I've watched it grow, over the past decade. I remember selling an app as a solo developer for 99 cents that would help you recognize poison ivy or poison oak or poison sumac. And just being some kid from New Jersey, watching this thing grow to, 10,000 downloads over the course of the summer, kind of a crazy experience. And I just fell in love with mobile at that point in time. And then, through the years, graduated college. I worked at a defense startup early on, trying to bring apps and iOS to the Navy and Coast Guard. Worked there for about 2 years. Eventually moved on, wanting to pivot and work in a consumer space. So I went to a development agency in Philadelphia called Conic Design. Worked on Abercrombie and Fitch and Hollister while they ported, React Native down to native Objective-C apps back in 2015. Ultimately learned Swift while I was there and worked on the Hinge rebrand in 2016 before joining Compass, where I've been for the past 5 years, working on features and scaling the team from 2 engineers to upwards of 40 now.
Wow, that's awesome. A lot of experience there. So Compass, in case the listeners don't know, is a company providing software for real estate agents. Can you tell us a bit more about the company itself?
Of course, yeah. So we call ourselves a tech-enabled brokerage. So you can think of us as a traditional brokerage for real estate agents, but all of the technology is built and maintained in-house. So there is a suite of products that real estate agents and their clients and just general consumers can use. They're all available through the App Store or on our website, compass.com.
Wow, awesome, thanks. So you have this team that's dedicated to building mobile infrastructure, and the developer's role is to maintain and iterate on the mobile platform specifically, which is quite a unique thing to do because not a lot of companies do that. Can you tell us about how this team was formed and how it has transformed throughout the years?
Yeah. So early on, Compass was a very scrappy startup when I joined. I remember eating lunch at a picnic table with the other, 25 engineers, and everyone kind of had a little area that they worked on. As teams grow and scale, which, I'm fortunate enough that this happened here, the amount of mobile people that we had working in one code base, eventually grew to a point where getting the app out the door was not something that became easy. So I would say around year 3, year 4, we had several feature-based teams that all worked on, almost like a siloed feature team development cycle. Getting the app out the door was something that was very ad hoc. It was whose feature is most important, who wants to build and deliver it to the App Store and compile it today. So it got to the point where we would spend, a week, fixing little odds and ends that maybe popped loose during from the previous release, which was not on a fixed cycle. And in 2019, there was a big push to let's have a cadence. We picked 2 weeks, and the first couple of times getting that release out the door over those 2 weeks was painful. but we learned how to operationalize it, how to get our act together. And we've actually brought that down to a 1 week cycle. But during that time, it became very obvious that, a feature team with a PM that's dedicated to a certain feature silo isn't always going to be willing to give you sprint velocity to work on how do you code sign the app, how do you, make sure that CI/CD doesn't fail, and all those things that eventually grew into mobile infrastructure. So we were able to, carve out a little team there, which worked on code signing. It worked on build issues. It worked on things that were also not large enough to have a dedicated feature squad either. So say, it's the summer, the new phones are coming out. You want to have the App Store content. You want to make sure that your build is not going to break on the new phone. Upgrading Xcode became a big portion of that. And it eventually grew into much more, which we're going to dive into today, hopefully.
So you've gone through quite a bit of an evolution when it comes to your CI/CD, from initially using an on-premise Jenkins and then transitioning to cloud-based solutions, then ultimately to Bitrise. And now you basically have everything automated on Bitrise, like building, testing, code signing, shipping, etc. I was wondering what kind of impact this has on your day-to-day job as a developer and also on your team dynamic.
So when I started at Compass, there was a stack of Mac Minis on someone else's desk. Ultimately came into work one day. I think someone had spilled either a cup of coffee or a glass of water on the whole stack. So our CI wasn't running. When I went to go see why, none of the computers would turn on anymore. So that kind of entered this journey that ultimately landed us here talking today. So out of the box, we were looking for something that would just, we could just have a drop-in replacement that maybe we wouldn't need to buy new hardware. So we looked at Circle CI early on. We looked at other cloud-based options and ultimately landed with Circle CI. We ran with them for a while. And what we were able to do there was, run tests on PRs, run the actual upload flow to the App Store through there. But it was very limited what we were actually leveraging at that point. We were still kind of figuring out what is mobile infrastructure, what is mobile DevOps, all of that. I would say around 2018, we kind of stumbled upon Bitrise, and just the ease of use with the workflow editor and the different projects, the different apps. It was very easy to kind of just like, let's drop this in, let's do a spike story here, let's see what we can do. And we've just been impressed that when you go there to drop in new functionality, there's always been a little bit more there available. So over the years, we've been leveraging CI just from the old adage of, if you're doing something manual, you should ultimately be able to automate it. So things that we've automated over the past year would be the entire release pipeline, including, code signing, uploading to the App Store, and working backwards from that customer deliverable perspective, which would be how do we measure quality, right? So we started with like 5% unit test coverage, eventually raised that up to 30 to 50. And now our team sits around 86% code coverage. And then looking to raise the bar there, what else could we do? We did a heavy dive on UI automation and how could we leverage that to exercise what we call customer workflows, basically how the feature vertical teams integrate across each other. So say you're doing a search, you find a listing, and then you save it to a collection, which is, some Compass terminology, but those are not all owned by the same team. So adding automation on top of that to verify that how the feature teams come together and how the ultimate customer deliverable works before we get it out the door was a huge initiative. We had about 80 hours of manual regression cycles that we used to run. So you can imagine we had 4 to 5 manual QA people as we were working on getting the app out the door. At first, this wasn't a big deal because we were building a release maybe every month, maybe every 2 months. We moved to 2 weeks. It was something that was tolerable, but when we tried to go down to 1 week, it was something that was just not possible to do manually. So we introduced automation there and slowly raised our automation percentage to sit around 80% over the past year. So how did we really do that? I would say, there's been a lot of effort coming up with the testing infrastructure side. And that's something that we've moved over to the mobile infra team. established patterns. We're using something called the robot pattern, which is like a scalable way to say, this is how you can interface with my screen. And then the different feature teams use those patterns to build automation tests. And as we automate the backlog of all the test cases that we had, slowly the amount of manual testing that we've had to do and the amount of time it takes to get the app out the door has steadily decreased. And over the past year, we were actually able to decrease it from around 80 hours to just under 4 hours by leveraging all these automation flows. Obviously, some of the challenges in there, maybe developers listening to this podcast will think UI testing is not stable, it's flaky, it fails all the time, you can't do it. It's just one of those things where you always hear the reasons why you can't, but once you pop open the hood, you use CI, you use automation, you just start with an assumption or you turn it into a concrete use case, something that either works or it doesn't. And if it's not working, we're all engineers, we roll up our sleeves and we got it to the point where it is today.
Wow, that's really fantastic. So 80% automation, and how has that enabled your team to scale by offloading all that automation?
Yeah, I mean, without leveraging the automation here, I don't think it would have been possible to maintain a 2-week release cycle, let alone actually get it down to a 1-week consistent release cycle where we are fully regressing everything in the app, while we're also adding new feature teams and expanding our feature sets, growing and scaling the team. We're actually still maintaining a decline in our regression time.
Wow, that's a pretty fast release cycle. And prior to automating everything, what was your release cycle like then?
It was very ad hoc. It was very much, who wants to build a release, who has the keys on their laptop, who can sign it. And that graduated more towards this bi-weekly cadence where it would be a swarm of QA engineers working with us to verify regression, the regression cycle of the app.
I'm curious about one thing, Russell. I was wondering why you said you had a 2-week cycle and you reduced it to 1 week. What did you gain by reducing it to 1 week? What was that advantage for you?
Yeah, that's a great question. So not only just the continued ability to ship new features, we actually use the word, we call it agility. So also when things go wrong, you also want to be able to get the app out the door and not make things worse. So say you were to have a production incident, you want to fix it as fast as possible and you want to get it out the door as fast as possible. Getting that down to the 4-hour, regression cycle that we have now means that if we have an issue that happens overnight, we could fix it and triage it in the morning and most likely ship it to Apple for review in the same day.
So it's partly to manage the occasional time where you might find a flaw and you want to override it with an update. Is that part of the reason for the 1-week cycle?
The 1-week cycle, so Compass is growing and scaling, and it's always more to do. There's more teams popping up left and right. So just ensuring that as, a sprint is 2 weeks, but say your feature's ready mid-sprint or something you've been working on for 3 months is now ready to launch, there's always a release that's going out the door. And it's something that just became very regimented. So we took a process that was very painful and actually made it quite, I don't want to say, pleasurable. So maybe I'll just say not painful.
Yeah. As automated as possible was the key to it, wasn't it?
Yes. Automation is the key here because without automation, your hands are tied, knowing how to go in and manually regress these things, mapping things as they change. If it's all automated, it's just a simple refactor or it's a simple bug fix. And that frees up our developers to just focus on the next big thing that they can chase, confidently knowing that the things they've already worked on are not breaking.
Do you have any control over features, like switch them on and off remotely when you make a release in order to deal with the possibility that one feature is not working and you can still control the release of the whole app?
Yeah. So the mobile team at Compass is a little different than some of the shops that I've worked at before in that we have an on-call rotation of 1 week. Similar to if you were a back-end engineer working on a critical service, we treat the app the same way. So we use Datadog SDK, and we have a decent amount of tooling and monitoring thresholds and dashboards that we monitor twice per day to see how are things in production. And then when we go to roll out new features, we use Optimizely in their SDK to roll out either to a selected beta group or to just a controlled ramp of the population. Within reason. There are some projects that's not easy to do it on, especially things that are maybe very early in the launch cycle or the boot time of the app. It's very hard to feature toggle those things because maybe your network stack is not fully initialized as the screen and the app is coming on. But I would say, 90 to 95% of the features that we build are feature flagged and ready to be turned off when they go out the door. That's also why this regimented process of a 1 week or a 2 week release cycle is very important for us. We have a roster of all the features that are going out the door. The more often we do it, the less is coming out the door. So say we launch an app, we notice a critical issue, we can reference which flags are currently on, and we can just toggle them off and see if that stabilizes things as we continue to triage, leveraging our dashboards and our logs that are monitoring live in production.
I'm wondering, how is your development team? You've built it over recent years, and they've obviously had to been using this CI/CD. Did they find it a good transition? What was the impact on their day-to-day work, and how did they react?
Oh, that's a great question, Kevin. I have something to add to this one. So let's say there's a scenario that a team is using Jenkins, and there's a set of DevOps engineers who are responsible for maintaining it. And the most important part of their skill set is being able to handle Jenkins issues like debugging and performance tuning. Would you say that they'd have a reason to worry that if they no longer use Jenkins, their jobs would become obsolete? Or is it rather just the annoying part of their jobs that they'd be able to get rid of?
Yeah, so just on that perspective, having run a homegrown Jenkins CI/CD pipeline in the past, I knew coming into Compass, once that magical opportunity where our boxes no longer worked happened, I was very eager to not have that be part of my day-to-day, just because of the known instabilities. And maybe this is subjective as a mobile developer. I don't want to be maintaining the CI/CD pipeline hardware and software updates. I've seen a situation where you're building something on Jenkins and maybe there's the famous pop-up that says it's time to update Java, and you have no idea why Jenkins is not, finishing your build. You turn on the TV, you find the keyboard for this box you probably keep in the corner, and you're like, Java, let's update this right now and then get back to work. Moving to the cloud-based solution with Bitrise is something where we know that it's going to be stable. We know that what you see is what you get, and it's not something that you need to worry about, which is great because that's freed up our team to explore ways to, I would say, turbocharge how we leverage CI/CD in our day-to-day.
I'm also wondering, if a new developer joins your team, is it part of their learning is to learn the Bitrise system that you're using? Do you find, how do they get on with that?
Our CI/CD pipeline is something where we do have a standard, and I think we may be a little different here where we actually commit the YML, which is the structured sequence of what command you're running, directly into our repo, and we leverage the offline workflow editor if we need to tweak it. So this allows the maintenance to not be tied to the box in the cloud. So this way, if you want to upgrade from one stack to another, it can also be tied to the PR that introduces those changes. But in terms of just learning our CI/CD workflow, we have some basic workflows that we then nest inside of these top level workflows, if you will. So one thing would be testing for a PR. That's something that's heavily reused because in there we have a step just for cloning, we have a step just for building, and we have a step just for running the unit tests. Each one of those steps, we also have a CLI that our team has written that calls out to Xcode build under the hood to actually test these things. So we're able to monitor in our own dashboard when we're cloning, how long is the clone phase? When we're building, how long is the build phase? When we're testing, how long is the test phase? And even within that, we have tooling inside of XC test, test cases, which we've extended to add logging code that we've written in Swift around these SDKs that we leverage out of the hood. So this way, within the testing phase, not only do we know how long the testing phase is, but what are the longest tests? What are the flakiest tests? So this way, everything is just in a dashboard. It's known. If you need something to do or you want to optimize one thing, it's right there. Here's your next best action. It's available at your fingertips. But learning the workflows, since they're standardized, we have the build, we have the test. We also leverage the tagging and releasing triggers on Bitrise quite heavily. So we have a modular architecture, which we've worked and put in place. So this way we can sort of version areas of our code base that aren't going out in the release. We know we don't need to regress them either. So we can have some optimizations there. But across these different repos where that code lives, the CI/CD workflow is the same. So anyone that onboards to the team can just read, a markdown document that says, this is how we use CI. This is what it's for. These are the lanes that we have. And no matter what team those developers end up working on, the process is completely standard across the board.
And you're doing both Java and, both Android and iOS development, correct?
Correct, yes. So Compass has Android-based developers, and they're largely based in Hyderabad, India, at our tech center down there. And all iOS is done in the States. And we also have some teams in Hyderabad as well that collaborate with our iOS teams.
So what kind of monitoring are you running for the app when it's live?
When the app is live, we leverage Datadog pretty heavily. So they're a real-time monitoring solution. And in there, we have different product metrics, but also different engineering excellence metrics that we have. So in there, we monitor the launch time, the compile time, the average network call time. And then we have these things broken out into, P50, P90, P95. So if we want to ever focus our attention on any part of our engineering culture, say we want to make our API results a little bit faster, we can go to these long tail ones and start attacking, any of the problem areas that ultimately surface to our customers. So this way we're best positioned to know if, you have a customer and they're reporting something to support. We can look into their account. We can pull up, their specific maybe session that they were on, and we can look into those network calls and say, this network call here was an anomaly or not. And even in Datadog, we can set thresholds and baselines. So this way, when something, goes just above those thresholds, we get an alert immediately in our on-call channel. And it's something that the team is best positioned to triage right then and there.
To me, you've obviously reduced a lot of pain of the whole process. Are you still looking at areas, you have areas in mind where you think, we really need to work on this area to improve the whole process? Yeah.
So Compass has a big culture of, everything can always be improved. And what you don't, you can't improve what you don't measure, right? So over the past year, we've actually improved the regression cycle, as I mentioned, bringing that down from 80 hours to 4 hours. Other things we've also improved would be the compile time of our app. We brought that down from somewhere where it was around 30 minutes to test on a PR. We've actually reduced it down to 20 minutes. We have ambitious goals to get that down towards 12 minutes. And you might say, well, how is that possible? But when you have something that's so well measured and the standardization, where time is spent on each step, you can know based on your ROI, my clone step is growing because maybe we have more history or we have more code that's getting downloaded. Is there a way that I could optimize by either decreasing my clone depth or checking out a branch instead of the whole code base? Another example would be testing as a whole. We have the test, maybe we measure it as 80% efficient, meaning 8 out of 10 times it succeeds. Why is it not succeeding those 20% of time? Can we introduce randomization, or can we, reorder the tests, or could we just remove that test? And will we actually get, a higher throughput on testing as a whole, because we're not getting pulled back by these, onesie twos that pull us down?
One thing that's clear to me from what you're saying is how much measurement you have now. And I think it's very interesting you make the comparison between that and, as you said, at one time people were doing things manually, and many people still are. But when they do that, they don't really see those kind of separations of a lot of time. This time was spent on this, time was spent on that. It's just trying to get it out the door and deploy to the app store. So this is a measurement benefit that before you do it, you don't realize how much you're going to get back.
Yeah, I mean, what you said strikes so many chords, right? Because I almost think we're always optimizing for more and getting things out faster and faster. It's honest to be honest with you, it's a big behavior change, even for myself, to say, let's plan this out. What does success look like here when we ship this? You know, what is the baseline now? How do you know if you're making it better or worse if you don't know where you're starting from? And I think especially when we're talking about like mobile DevOps and mobile infrastructure, these things are not visual. It's not something, you know, unless you can maintain all these mental models in your head, having a dashboard frees up your mind to just think about how can I make that better versus trying to understand what are all the systems, how are they all interplaying. The best you can take those mental models and apply them into dashboards or monitoring, you're just going to free up yourself to take on more and more challenges and make things better over time.
Yeah, I think also from the point of view of someone who is a mobile developer myself, and thinking how mobile developers think they like to work on the app, and the deployment process is a piece of pain they have to go through, and they'd rather not do it. But at least if you're getting dashboards and valuable information that is improving your app, then it doesn't seem so pointless. It adds value and makes it, from the mobile developer's point of view, yeah, CI/CD is giving me something. I would think that that's true too.
Yeah, for sure. But I don't want to give you the impression that we're a bunch of scientists in white lab coats. I think someone said it isn't really a fight if you can't lose, right? So we've taken a few, not gambles, but, things that are maybe counter to how the industry does things as well to best position us to try and solve these problems. Because we also only have so many people. We only have so much time. We only have so much mental energy in a day, right? So I would say some of the things we've also explored are, a more modular architecture. So back when the app was, 2 to 5 to 10 to 15 developers, we had one mono repo. But as things became more siloed, it wasn't obvious where some of the lines were. So a feature team, A, and there's feature team B. If B is leveraging something from A, but A changes it to match their feature and B doesn't know about it, when we would go to regress, we would be like, oh man, why is this not working? I haven't touched it, any of that. So what we've done is we've actually added some layers to our system. So we have an infrastructure tier, and this is where a lot of like our persistence and shared core services, network downloading, image downloading, monitoring, core things that are either swizzled into architecture to gather metrics or make it more reusable. In that layer, we also have a design system components and reusable components. So this way, if you're a feature developer working on a new feature, say it has 50% of your design has a design system in there, you're just picking Legos out of the bin, snapping them together, adding the business logic as you need, and getting those things out the door. All of our features are in between the app and our infrastructure layer, and they are isolated in a way where they don't directly import each other. So this way, there's no cyclical references to each other. This is something we put in place with CocoaPods and leveraging CocoaPods Roam to pre-build these binaries and leveraging Artifactory to kind of store these binaries. So this way, when you pull them down in your pod file, you actually already have these things pre-built. So this way, not only are these things versioned, but you're also not compiling from source anymore. So your build times across the system are something that we, with Swift have actually brought down from 5 minutes to, around 1 minute. And there are plans to get it down even further as well.
Right. When you look back, do you see like key milestone points which you reached where you saw a significant change and improvement as you went through this?
Yeah, that's a great question. So we kind of ran two trains, right out of the gate. One was, let's figure out how we could automate anything, right? Let's go after a critical flow for each feature. So we got 1 to 5 flows that we should automate, and figured out how to actually build scalable architecture components that could be reused by feature teams to build automation and automate their backlog. While we were doing that, understanding the use case, we always try to work from who's our customer, what are their needs, and how do we directly work backwards from that situation. So there, our customers were QA. We were leveraging something called TestRail, which is basically a giant Google sheet with some IDs and some descriptions, but it also managed state. So they were manually regressing the app, clicking things done, pass, fail, and then rerunning. And then things that were failed, they would mark, green instead of red. We wrote a little Swift wrapper around that API, which was fully documented, put that into our infrastructure layer. And now when we run automation code or unit test code, we're actually, updating our current regression status automatically. So that was quite a substantial effort there. It also opened the door to say, could we actually automate everything? Some things that were not automated would be push notifications and universal links. So we did a deep dive there. And when we adopted either it was Xcode 11.5 or 11.7, they had this new thing under the hood that allowed the command line to call back to the simulator. So we were able to, inject either a JSON payload or a universal link to then trigger the app and actually verify that it was clicking into the app. We were able to do that by leveraging the iMessage app that comes on the phone, pasting a link there, hitting send, clicking it, and building the bot that would just do that flow for us, and then verifying that it went to the proper page and routed correctly in the app. That's something where we took something that took, I'm pretty sure it took us about 8 hours, almost a full day, to verify every single combination of push notifications and deep links that we supported. And that's because there's so many permutations for a given deep link. It depends on who you are as a user. Are you logged in or not? Are you an agent or not? Are you a client of an agent? And supporting all those permutations required us to actually come up with a technical solution. This is something we've actually recently open sourced, which is called the Muscle framework, MUSSEL framework. And one of our brilliant engineers, Renato Gamboa, worked on this, and it's fully available. And this is something we run every night with our nightly automation builds and on every release. So as we add new push notifications and as we add new universal links, the infrastructure is there. So just out of the box, instead of adding, say, 30 to an hour to verify your new links and push notifications, it's something that's done just in a matter of seconds. So these are the things where, you invest in a piece of mobile infrastructure and the ROI on it just continues to be seen over time. And then we're maintaining that these things don't degrade and rot because they're versioned, and then they themselves have their own, CI/CD pipeline. So this way, if we wanted to, something we do often would be use the Bitrise triggers to say, this is running on this stack, and that's a prefix. But if we change the prefix of the branch to maybe Xcode 12 and change the stack to run that on Xcode 12, we can manually go into Bitrise, kick off a build, and just see what breaks, for these other things, and run that at a cadence where you're getting these knowledge. And of course, all of this stuff leverages Bitrise's like Slack integration. So right into our channels, we can just see what is the failures, what are things that are popping loose or not.
Great.
I'd love to talk also about the other train that left the station, which was our modular architecture project. So in there, the goal of this project was, how could we have a team, release independently to production? So you can think of this from what we call a hot fix or an incident perspective. Something is wrong. I want to ship the fix out, and I don't want to break anything else out, that isn't related to that fix. So because all of these, our teams are in their own repositories and they're all versioned, when we actually go to do a fix, we can just version and isolate the code that needs to change and then bring it into the app on top of the last production tag, merge one PR, and it just takes off on Bitrise. We don't need to touch the automation flow. We don't need to log in or upload to iTunes or any of that stuff. It's there, it's stable, and every time that there's an incident, we just leverage the infrastructure that's already in place. That whole effort, when you're talking about milestones there, the milestones would be proving that this was a good idea. I think when you talk about monolith versus microservices, this is like tabs and spaces, right? So this is something where even today, we're still challenging notions of things that, maybe subjectively feel wrong or are actual problems, meeting with other developers and addressing those concerns. So the first thing we were able to do was pull out the infrastructure layer. So what was this? This was, universal links, push notifications, the core services that I mentioned, and moving them to a separate repo, which allowed us to understand how decoupled is this from our feature teams. And we learned that the answer was not really. So there was, it basically became a signal. Why is a feature team developer coming and changing this core service while they're building that new feature? Is it not reusable enough or decoupled enough so that this way, that those changes aren't required? So it required us to really decouple the system, really think and re-architect how a lot of the app was built in a way where you do have these concrete units that are almost like utility libraries or, what we call the infrastructure layer. So this way, if you're going to build a new feature, you're just reusing these components. You're not actually building or need to tweak them at all. That was the first milestone, just getting there and saying, hey, look, we've done 2 releases and we actually didn't need to touch this anymore because we were able to monitor and say, maybe during a given release cycle, there were 10 commits in this area. Now there are 2 or 1, and those are acceptable, or in some cases, it's not needed anymore. And that is what we would call success. The bigger milestone here was, okay, we have 2 repos. We were leveraging Carthage at the time. Carthage is something that pre-compiles your SDKs in the app. So this way, unlike CocoaPods, you're not building from source and you get a big hit on your compile times. So we were able to see how, well, first of all, Carthage, because it pre-compiles those binaries, you have to make a decision whether or not you want to commit them or you want to store them, off of your computer, because Git only supports 100 megs off the bat before you have to deal with Git LFS, which is still something that most people don't recommend you use. So we were leveraging, I think it was even called Carthage Roam. There's a lot of these Roam tools out there for this problem that would store it in S3. So these builds were then stored in S3, and then you would go and you would download them. But that required another piece of tool chain for us, which was AWS and managing the, onboarding developers there. And we have, multi-factor 2FA, and you have too many of those and it's just not that much fun. So that's another pillar we try to balance, which would be, developer happiness. So we were able to look at CocoaPods and see how could we maybe get rid of that large file system storage problem that we had, and also make sure that all of our dependers, our vendors and our third-party libraries were actually supported. Carthage is something where they really need to opt into it. CocoaPods is something that is almost a default that most third parties leverage. So we were able to use CocoaPods to make sure that our vendor dependencies were actually 100% coverage. Before that, it was maybe in the 30%. So that's another opportunity where we took, measurements and said, what is our baseline? How do we move forward? If we want to prove that moving teams into their own repositories is a good idea, how do we actually know that it will be supported and it will work? So that's something where we actually swapped the build tool or the build system from Carthage to CocoaPods, and we're able to see those at least the ability to hold version things that was gained. The downside there was you're no longer pre-building these things. So you're downloading the source, compiling from source. So our PR times actually spiked and our compile times spiked because now you're compiling more source. So in there, we were able to leverage CocoaPods Roam, which is a plugin. When we actually tag the release for a given repo on CI/CD, we then lint it, we push the spec to our spec repos, and then we actually pre-build these binaries and push them to Artifactory. So this way, when we download them later on, we're not spending any time compiling things that don't need to be compiled. So we actually solved, what Carthage was doing, plus making sure that we could version everything that we would want, including our third-party libraries. Moving on from there, since we had all these multi-repository structures, almost every mobile team has a little bit of shell or bash or something that you're a mobile dev and you're just kind of copy and pasting things from Stack Overflow and making it work inside of your repository. So we reached a decision point where it was, should we, copy these scripts around, which no one ever really wants to do, or should we find a way to, be a little bit more dry here, right? Don't repeat yourself. So we actually took it upon ourselves to write our own custom CLI. We call it Clyde, which stands for the CLI development environment. And in there, it's a Ruby project that we then add our own reusable commands, which also plugs into when we were talking about earlier about how standard is our workflows and our CI and all of that. Because the commands are in one central spot, they're not copied, they live there, they're unit tested, there's integration tests there as well. They're then repeated across, the interface for that is then repeated across all the other repositories. So again, we're leveraging consistency, good software engineering practices. And that also allowed us to put more tooling code now in Ruby. So we have some that's in Ruby, some that's in Swift, some that's, in production on backend services and all of that. And we're just basically able to monitor, the development pipeline now. So not just what's in production, but also while we're in the course of the development cycle, how are we actually regressing these things? How are commits making it out the door? When is a commit getting regressed? And that was a major milestone for us to be able to build a CLI and reuse it across the teams. The final problem that we had to solve in Q3, Q4 was we have a monolithic app. We have an infrastructure layer. We know we want to pull out feature teams to be completely independent. How do we start doing that? So we had to build, something that we were leveraging for push notifications and universal links in order to automate that. We made something that was called the router, which basically would support, native deep linking in iOS, which is unfortunately is not supported out of the box. So we were able to scale that and actually have that work for view controllers. So now view controllers are, something where they can grow and they can get a little bit of hair over time. We actually use MVVM, but even MVVM doesn't prevent MVC being massive view controller. So leveraging the router and talking through what we call an event or a router event, which would be, think of it as like a two-way binding or, a decoupled bridge. And these types live in the infrastructure layer, but all the view controllers and all the view components can live in the feature modules. So if search wants to talk to maybe an agent productivity feature set, it'll send an event through the system and asynchronously, it'll navigate and, push those things onto the screen. So that was the last major milestone. When we got there, we were actually able to pull out, one critical feature per each feature squad that we had and prove that that was a good idea. So that was the last major milestone. And I'll tell you, it wasn't easy getting there, but that proved out the concept that this was an idea that was worth investing in. And it took us about a year to really get there with a team that started out with a team size of 2. The team is now 5. And what are the next goals that we're looking to hit? Some of those next goals would be, we have all of these regression cycle items that we run after the commits get to the main mono repo. So how do we make sure that those commits get, how do we fail faster on some of these changes in the system? So what we're introducing is in each feature layer, we're going to introduce a sandbox app. And inside of that sandbox app will be an app target of non-production code that gets assembled inside of a dynamic library. That's maybe your feature SDK, a unit test target, and a UI test target. And we're slowly bringing our UI test targets now from our main app down into our feature sandbox areas. So this way, those are things that we could, if they're small, we could even run them on a PR. Since we've gotten our PR times down so much, could they go up a little bit, or could we maintain them or make them go down? And now that we have all the testing infrastructure and all the monitoring infrastructure in place, as we start to pilot these new programs to get that time down, we could actually know whether or not this is a good idea, while we're also learning, how are we failing faster? How are we making sure that these customer problems we catch sooner and sooner? So this way we can almost catch them on the commit level or on the PR level instead of in production. And that's our big goal this year, which would be to get that 4-hour regression time actually down to 1 hour, while we also plan to spin up, new teams and continue doing what we're doing. So not only continue and maintain what we have, but actually action on it and improve it during the course of this year.
Cool. That's very, very interesting. And I have one more question, actually. If somebody is, a team is starting on the journey that you've been on, so they are looking at bringing DevOps and CI/CD, what kind of learning resources would you recommend to them? Anything that would help them along the journey of DevOps, webinars, courses, whatever? What would you point them at?
I mean, yeah, that's a great question. There's a lot of good podcasts out there. I know I've always been a reader, so some of the books I always recommend people read would be, Clean Code, Refactoring, and I view a lot of what we're doing is really just refactoring something that's a manual process, adding a little bit of tooling, and then at that point, it's just a software problem. So in terms of real resources to use, I know myself, I didn't start as a mobile developer. I know I kind of picked it up, and I picked it up on the fly, leveraging those free Stanford courses back in the day. They used to be on Apple, iTunes U. Team Treehouse. I feel like I owe them a debt. I think back in the day for students, it was like $5 or $9 a month. I would just, when I woke up in the morning, I would try and burn through a couple classes on there at night, and then eventually, picked up Objective-C mostly through just watching those Stanford courses and using Team Treehouse. Again, those are more like how to pick up mobile developer stuff. I would say this podcast is pretty good. I've actually listened to a few. Listened to the one with John Sindel. That guy, I don't know how he does it. He's working a full-time job, but he's also writing books and doing podcasts. Maybe he's a CI/CD automation machine as well. But yeah, there's a lot of good stuff out there.
I don't know how he does it either. I think Damien has a question.
Yeah, sure. So you mentioned Clyde, the friendly CLI. Could you tell us a little bit more about what Clyde does and how that helped improve things?
Yeah, Clyde, the friendly CLI. Yeah, I like that tag. Might take that. CLI, what am I trying to say here? So how do we leverage Clyde? So Clyde was, as we moved from a mono repo to a multi-repo, how do we not end up, copy and pasting a lot of these shell scripts that live inside of your repo, or these odds and ends that, you end up having, but you want to have everywhere. So what we've done is we added a shell. I think we leveraged like slop, which is like a Ruby argument parser, and just a gem spec and a pod spec there to push a lot of our shell scripting into Clyde, having a standard command line interface, using a tool like slop out of the box gave us something that was like, here's your basic menu. Here's how you can use this tool. Inside of that repository, we actually added our own Xcode project as well. And that Xcode project, when we push up a PR, we then actually use the CLI tools to make sure that it still builds, tests, and archives on that project that's, within the repo itself. So this way, as we add and scale and maintain our own CLI that we then use to tool our, CI/CD mobile pipeline, that there's no regressions introduced into that pipeline. We treat that pipeline as like a first-class citizen.
Gotcha. Very, very powerful. And then you mentioned the Muscle framework as a way to kind of automate push notifications and things like that. So if somebody wanted to start using Muscle today, what sort of advice would you give them? How about to go with that?
Well, hopefully we have a good README there. It's ready out of the box. I would say to leverage Muscle, it definitely works best with a UI automation target. So, if you're not familiar with UI automation, which I do feel is kind of, a tenet of mobile development that is kind of lacking, across the board. Just picking up some skills there and learning how to automate these things. There's a lot of opportunity and powerful tools that still don't exist. But leveraging Muscle to just get those, that locking in the functionality of deep links and push notifications. So this way you don't end up needing to rewrite the wheel. This was an area where there weren't many tools out there that did this. So we took a stab at kind of adding our own, clean example out there. And yeah, if anyone wants to enhance the use case or open issues on there, we have a dedicated team that will be there to support it.
I also saw that you have a good article on Muscle on Medium written by you, by yourself. Yeah.
Part of our culture as well is, writing blog posts, putting it out there. So celebrating the wins. We spend so much time tooling and understanding, what percentage we want to change things from what baseline to what new baseline, or growing things, or how you want things to improve. So part of that would be a deep dive into how did you build that? How does it work? What learnings could we actually share with the wider mobile community? And that's our engineering blog, as you mentioned. It's called Compass True North, which is hosted on medium.com. There's links to this on our website, compass.com, as well.
I'm really interested in the muscle framework. It sounds pretty powerful. And is there any plans to add like app clip support, widget supporting, like other kind of side things to it?
That's a good question. So a lot of why we build something or why we choose to invest in something is because it's a customer need, or it's something that is a priority. So even right now, we don't have a need for app clips. That doesn't mean that we don't. I would say it's just more of it hasn't been on a roadmap yet. So as these things become available, either the team will build it, or if it gains traction out there in the open source community, that's something where if someone's willing, they can open a PR against it, and our team will probably review it within a day. We have pretty good PR culture at Compass.
Awesome, thanks.
I'd love to talk about the fan out strategy, if we could, as well.
Yeah, sure.
While we were trying to enter our automation journey, I know, Damien, we've picked your brain a few times in the past, and Bitrise published this strategy for testing. In the old velocity plan, you paid for concurrency of the boxes. So within that, there was like a 90-minute upward bound limit. Having a company that had about 1,500 automation tests that we were running through our CI/CD pipeline, we needed to have a way to ensure that we would never have a scenario where the batch of tests that we chose to run would hit 90 minutes. And that's where we actually leveraged Bitrise and the fan out strategy. I think you guys actually had a blog post or something on that, and then we reached out to you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah. So being able to parallelize and even shard your tests so that you can, optimize, right? Because there's only so much parallelization you can do, at the Xcode simulator level. But as you start to, spread it out horizontally, you can then actually benefit from both speed improvements and stability improvements. And I've been working really closely with a lot of customers to improve how we do that, right? To, update our steps and support the sort of things that they need. So, a good example is the collect artifacts from children that we added to the step. So when you do generate all of these, sharded test reports, you can bring those artifacts back to the parent and consume them in a single report then.
And I think inside of that, we actually, you were asking what's an application where we use Clyde. We actually use Clyde inside of our initial fan out strategy, where we say, here are all of our tests. And then we actually create test plans on the fly and then fan them out using the Bitrise API to spawn up, X amount of jobs. So this way there's a, consistent amount of tests in each one. And as barring no long tail tests, you'll never hit that 90-minute, barrier. And I would say that technology was probably essential to us being able to hit that weekly, 4-hour goal that we had over the past year. And it's something that's probably going to be even more important as we look to move these tests and fail faster, closer and closer to the commit level. Being able to say, I have these 20 tests, but I want to fan them out and run them in parallel. You could say, what's your longest test? Maybe it's 4 minutes, maybe it's 5 minutes. That's the maximum amount of time that it's going to take to add all of that extra quality to your pull request. And that's a goal of ours over the next year, to sort of bring those tests down, but also run them in parallel, leveraging the infrastructure that Bitrise has provided to make sure that we're not adding an exorbitant amount of time to our developers, which is, as you hear these mobile DevOps use cases, it's almost always about how do you make other teams faster? How do you force multiply your company? And that's really a big theme of this team.
Yeah, and that's a common thing that we're seeing from a lot of customers, where improving a build speed has such a huge multiplier effect on the team that's waiting for those builds to finish, right? Because if you have 100 developers waiting for a 1-hour build, that's 100 hours they spend waiting, right? So maybe to go get a coffee, it's very hard to context switch and work on something else while you're still in that mode waiting for validation. So, the benefit of cutting a wait time in half, it really has an outsized impact on developer productivity, releasing features to the customers. And I'd love to understand, before you started using parallelization and you moved to that, like what sort of performance change did you see?
In terms of our CLI, like total time for some of these steps? Yeah. So actually, I think around the time we started, automating the backlog, building the amount of tests that we had, that took us quite a bit. And then we actually started hitting this 90-minute limit. So we hit it maybe 3 months into that process. And out of the box, we said, okay, well, then we'll make 2 testing schemes. And we started multiplying our testing schemes across the board. So then we would say, these tests live over here, these tests live over here. And it was, search, and the other one was like, feature B. So that only scales so much. And that's an entirely manual process. You have to go in Xcode, you have to generate these things. I think we had like 3 or 4 at one point in time. And we read the fan out article. We every now and then we would add, a long tail test to something that existed. And it was happening more and more as the team started to pick up speed, automating that backlog. And it actually probably couldn't have lined up at a better time when the fan out strategy came out, because we said, we need that and we need it yesterday. How can we make that happen? And I think, me and you and Lucas Lane on the team, we got on a few calls and we were able to turn around a prototype inside of like maybe 2 days. I think we met on like a Monday or Tuesday and showed you something on like a Thursday. And you were like, yep, that looks like it's working well,
That's a really awesome success story.
Oh, that's really nice to hear. If you guys don't have any more questions, I have a personal one, my favorite. How do you describe your job to your parents or grandparents?
My parents think that people call me and I tell them how to hook their printer up. So I gave up on answering that question a while back. But I tell my friends and family that I make apps on the phone, and that's broad enough answer. They understand that, I whatever that means to certain people, luckily for some other people that are in tech, I could mention that I work on, mobile infrastructure, work on mobile apps. I would say even in the community, though, mobile infrastructure is not a word. It's not a buzzword. And I really think we're in like the beginning of a new wave of front-end development. So maybe over the next 5 years or something like that, we'll see these infrastructure roles for mobile front end start to open up, just as how like a full stack developer or a back end developer or microservice developer, these things started to evolve over the past 10 years. Where we are right now is it's like the pioneering phase. Some of the things we decide to do and take on as a team, they feel novel to me. Maybe they're not, but you can't just dig on Medium for days. I would say some of the things we're trying to build around automating manual steps within what we call our bump trains. So say you're bringing a change from the lowest level to the highest level. How do you do that? Right now, you tag a release on GitHub. Then once it's done pre-compiling and storing in Artifactory, you watch Bitrise flow. Once it's green, you then go to the next repo, you clone it, you then update your pod file, reintegrate it, see if there's any breaking changes, and then you rinse and repeat all the way up the stack. We're actually working on a tool that we call Bump It Up, which is just a tool we work on that tries to automate and mimic what you do as a developer, even at that level. Right. So this way we can just save that time you would have spent watching builds on CI and not really being, present in whatever you actually should be achieving. You're able to just kick off a release and the rest of it will be automated up the stack as much as we can, and we're trying to learn how to, once we have the changes updated and the pod installs are run, opening a PR, and this is leveraging, I think GitHub has a PR CLI that we're also leveraging, opening the PR. If it's green, where should the human checks be? Where should the machine checks be? These are still things that when you were asking about, what are references where you can learn and stuff. And I think sometimes for what we're doing, you have to read up on web, right? And how did web do this? And as much as we say mobile first, a lot of the technologies and things that are becoming mobile infrastructure are just adaptations of these other patterns and systems that have been in place. And the industry has worked on hardening their approach to those things over the past 5 years. And I look forward to helping, this industry and mobile infrastructure become a thing and continue that investment and bring it forward into the future and just see what happens.
Yeah, it does kind of feel like the modular kind of movement in mobile is like the microservice movement in backend, right? Where they want to have kind of single responsibility, easy to test, easy to update types of smaller repositories. So it's definitely a growing trend.
And we have plans over the next year to try and automate that process in itself. So say we have, this is what we have now. We have an infrastructure tier, we have some feature tiers, and then we have an app that sits on top of that. Say you wanted to spin up a new team. How would you do that today? You would need really good documentation. You'd probably need a few good senior engineers to come and help hook everything up. And then you would also need to train that team just like out of the box. How do you start getting these things working? We actually established what we're calling a moonshot here at Compass, which would be how could you use a command that lives in our CLI to actually generate that whole step for us? So what does that involve? We looked and did a deep dive on a tool called Twist or Twist. I'm actually not sure how to say it. It's TW or TUIST on GitHub. This is an Xcode generation project upstart that's doing a lot of stuff, not just generating Xcode like Xcode Gen used to do, but it's also introducing ways where you can, template code, add boilerplate code over time. We're also working on tools, having CocoaPods right now, looking to adopt SPM this year, but leveraging ERB, which is like a templator for Ruby. How could we actually template the Bitrise YML in a way where we already know what those commands are because it's so standardized? If you knew you were going to generate, my new feature, you would just also template that across the Clyde commands, and then it would actually have CI/CD out of the box. And because these things are so standard, and because there's a YML that exists that leverages things that will work out of the box on Bitrise, we're able to just add a new team that has a standard Xcode project, a standard CI/CD release stream, boiler templated projects, whether you want to use UIKit and MVVM, or if you wanted to, there's another thing we're looking at, Swift UI with maybe Redux, or just, Swift UI plus Combine out of the box or something like that. And also, because we're investing in tools like Bump It Up, how could you run a command on your computer, have this new layer, feature team just be spun up instantly, and have all of the relevant PRs elsewhere in the system to just configure this out of the box, right? And that's where we start building a mobile platform, which is really what we're trying to build here. Is just how do we service, the macro architecture of a mobile front end using all of these tools and just elevating them to a new, height, basically treating them as products, right? So a lot of us wear the PM hat on the infrastructure team as well, because these things are so intangible. You really kind of got to dream big and just obsess about the opportunity here to just make things better. I think I'm lucky at Compass to work with some of the most skilled, deep engineers that are really well-rounded software engineers that also work on mobile as well. So, some of these things would be nowhere without the team that I work with.
All right, so that's all the time we had for today. Kevin, Damian, thanks so much for being here. And Russell, it's been a pleasure talking to you and learning about your use case. I think it really is a cutting-edge example of how to build mobile infrastructure. So it was really interesting. You can find out more about Russell at russellstephens.dev and find some more resources we mentioned in the show notes. Thanks everyone for listening, and stay tuned for the next episode. Bye.